Hello and welcome to the Astrology of Family Karma and Relationships podcast. I'm your host, Alexandra Mallon, and tonight we have an unusual broadcast. We have, all of us, an unusual astronomical event that's occurring in the year 2025, and that is Saturn's powerful ring plane crossing event. As Saturn is edge on to our earthbound line of sight, the question comes up, does this Saturn cycle promise freedom or perhaps subjugation? And as we go forward here, I do want to say that we are still a pretty new podcast. So I would really greatly appreciate, folks, if you would go to visit me on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and do be sure to subscribe so those computer algorithms can know that I'm out there and help list our program for others to enjoy. Please do turn your friends on. Let them know that I'm out there, and I thank you greatly for that effort. So, just about 2 weeks ago now, on March 23rd of 2025, Saturn had its exact ring plane crossing. Exact ring plane crossing. When it was from our line of sight at the Earth, the ring slowly turning to an edgewise view. So you could say those seven rings system around Saturn that help it shine so brightly in the nighttime sky are beginning to sort of turn progressively over a series of years to a more edge-on line of sight. Now, those of you who know me well, or perhaps have been clients of mine or students of mine, know that I began my journey as a professional astrologer, as a very avid backyard astronomer, which I am these years still. I've been actually a backyard astronomer for about a decade longer than I've been a pro astrologer. And for astronomers, this event of Saturn's ring plane crossing is a really big deal. This is really a time period over the centuries when astronomers have located many moons of the planet Saturn. It's also when the moons of Saturn from our line of sight cross in front of, or have a planet crossing event for astronomers to view. So it's a really wonderful thing, a fascinating thing, and a scientifically significant phenomenon for astronomers to have Saturn have a ring plane crossing. That is an event that occurs every 14 years. In Saturn's 29.5-year orbit of our sun, its rings will be at this wide open phase that we see here, and also every 14 years, it'll be at a ring plane crossing event where the rings appear to disappear. So this 15-year cycle, roughly, of ring plane change, astrologically speaking, we want to interpret what this perhaps might imply. The rings open or fully shining with the light of the sun, might they imply a full limitation of Saturn's restrictive nature? And that ring plane crossing event, conversely, when the rings disappear from our line of sight, does that imply that the limits and constraints that Saturn normally suggests to astrologers somehow are removed or disappear? So this montage of Saturn cycles gives you a really good sense over a period of time that this ring plane crossing event doesn't happen rapidly. So from 2001 to 2029, we see a number of phases of Saturn's rings from earthbound view be wide open to our line of sight, and then progressively over a series of years, narrow and narrow and narrow from our viewpoint to where we have been in 2009 more recently, and now again 2025 at this ring plane crossing event. So one thing to note is that when Saturn has those rings wide open to our line of sight, Saturn is really brilliant in the nighttime sky. Conversely, in 2009 and 2025, and those years just before 2025 and 2009, respectively, as you see the Saturn year by year changing its perspective, Saturn becomes dimmer and more dim each year progressively. So Saturn at ring plane wide open, bright, bright, bright at night. Saturn ring plane crossing, very, very dim like it is this apparition of 2025. So it might be a good moment to sort of just go back for those of you who don't know about astrology and what Saturn means to astrologers and students of astrology. Saturn we consider to be the planet of responsibility. It is the responsible self. It talks about keywords like structure and restriction, discipline and responsibility, obligation. So to understand Saturn and its cycles, it's helpful to understand that Saturn astrologically talks about these important developmental phases. Its cycles around the sun happen to just purely coincide. That's what astrology is about, looking at cycles of nature. So its cycles of nature coincide with human developmental cycles. In other words, every 7-year period, Saturn makes a different orbital placement to where it was when we were born. So at age 0 to 7, Saturn is 90 degrees away after 7 years. At age 14, for every human being on the planet, Saturn will be halfway around its orbit, opposite or in opposition to where it was when we were born. You can sort of think of like a full moon, since the full moon every month has the sun on one side of the sky, the earth in between, and the moon opposite. So when you have a full moon every month, you see that whole disk of the moon shining super brightly. You could say at age 14, Saturn opposite the placement it had when we were born is in some way illuminating. Yeah, you can sort of say at age 14, most of us think that we have finally achieved adulthood, independence, and at age 14, generally most of us think that the adults who are supervising us might have become rigid or ossified, great Saturnian words, since in medical diagnostic astrology, Saturn governs all skeletal structure, bony structures, cartilage structure of the body, even the dermis itself of the body. That is the container. All are astrologically ruled, they say, by the planet Saturn, because Saturn in nature coincides with these structures. Age 7, the budding development of individual self and a sense of independence. Age 14, we know we're adults now at 14, and those adults who are supervising us have become rigid and old and don't see things clearly and freshly with a healthy perspective that we have. At age 21, the next 7-year phase. For every person, we then decide we really come to total maturation. We have come to a place of relational maturation. And then finally, Saturn's orbit around the sun, a 30-year orbit. At age 30, we truly come to a sense of self-awareness and maturity and wisdom. So it's great also to take note that since Saturn's orbit is 30 years around the sun, and that orbit of Saturn coincides for humans with these developmental phases that we have. It's just purely coincidental, by pure sort of cycle of nature, if you will, that every 7 years we go through this change of being, as I said. So there is a first Saturn return, astrologically speaking, and a second Saturn return, astrologically speaking. So the first 30 years of our lives, when Saturn has a particular place in our chart and begins to orbit around the sun. So again, age 14 opposite, age 21 closing square, age 30 its first full cycle. These are phases, these first 7-year periods up to age 30 of really discovering self. So you could sort of say the first Saturn returning to where it was when you were born at age 30 roughly for each of us, that occurs with autonomy, a real maturation and a sense of individual adulthood. The second Saturn return cycle, that does actually mathematically occur around age 58 and a half or 59 technically, but in astrological parlance we sort of say age 30 and age 60 are those Saturn periods. Those Saturn return from where that was when we started at our birth, 2 orbits now. So age 30 you could say autonomy and maturity, and age 60 one could say that we've really achieved proper and full maturity. By the way, since cycles of nature always continue throughout our lives, as we approach age 90, then I typically joke with my clients, the 90-year-olds out there say, oh, you 60-year-old kids, what the hell do you know? You're just kids. You're barely discovering who you really are. So age 30, we discover autonomy and maturity. Age 60, we discover who we truly are because of what we've experienced and what we've done, what we've accomplished. And then we also reflect back upon our accomplishments and whether they have brought us joy or suffering, success or challenge, and also the wisdom of those experiences. And then, of course, age 90. So you could say from the second Saturn return, most astrologers don't really pay attention when you hit that second Saturn return. It's sort of a culminative thing. But those of us who go on age-wise, age 59, 60, age 66, age 73, age 80, age 87, 88. So every 7 years, even from 60 onwards to 90, there are other developmental plateaus, developmental milestones. So start to think about Saturn as, and its cycles, as coinciding for humans with developmental milestones, developmental plateaus. That's a really key factor about understanding the nature of our human self and how Saturn and its cycles coincide. This graph is a really excellent graph also. It shows from 1993 to 2020 that same phenomenon of Saturn going around the sun and its ring phase orientation shifting from wide open to ring plane crossing. So here, the ring plane crossings of the 20th century, 1907, 1920 and 21, 1936, 1950, 1966, 1980, 1995. Ring plane crossings of the 21st century, 2009, 2025 this year, 2039, the next big upcoming triple ring plane crossing. You'll see with this graph that there are some ring plane crossings that are singular, that happen one crossing from the earthbound point of view. There are other time periods, for instance, 1966, where there's a triple ring plane crossing. That means that the central or second ring plane crossing will be when Saturn is in opposition to the Sun and therefore especially bright. So that's an unusual close apparition, a little bit brighter for ring plane crossing when the rings disappear. So we actually have two ring plane crossings in a 30-year period, and we have two ring plane wide open, maximum super shining, super bright periods. Those Saturn ring plane or edge-on periods, 1774, 1789, 1848, 1862, 1936, 1950, 1966, 1980, 1995, 2009, 2025. So those Saturn disappearing rings, Saturn rings edge-on periods, they occurred concurrently by coincidence with, let's say, 1774, the birth of our nation, the U.S. American Revolution. 1789, when George Washington became our first U.S. president, and also 1789, the French Revolution was another Saturn disappearing, rings disappearing. This idea of the rings symbolizing the power of Saturn, or the constraint of Saturn, or the structure of Saturn, Saturn's quality of limitation. Consider that Saturn's orbit being a 30-year orbit. If you go back a few 100,000 years ago and you lived to the ripe old age of Saturn, Saturn would be implying in its return at age 30 that you were getting old. 200,000-300,000 years ago, Saturn at age 30, its first return, your terminus, your end years were coming. And certainly as millennia rolled forward for humans, age 30 was certainly a time of maturation. We could sort of look back even just 1,000 years ago, and what people would do in terms of maturity by age 30 oftentimes would be sort of radical accomplishments compared to 20th and 21st century peoples, consider that the average age of marriage perhaps might have been 10 or 11 or 12 or 13 for a girl, and maybe 16 or 18 for a boy. So things, of course, have shifted a bit. We don't see that age 30 as being sort of such a Saturnian time of taking responsibility. But nonetheless, culturally, one thing has remained, that physical maturation and the maturation in the outer world are all concordant with Saturn cycles. So this Saturn edge on, when those rings that symbolize constraint or strength or brightness or power of Saturn, those edge-on periods occurred when we had our Revolutionary War, when the French Revolution occurred. During 1862 was an edge-on period. 1861, the U.S. Civil War broke out. We had ring plane crossing at 1936. Of course, 1936 was that time period when we had the beginnings of the rise of the Third Reich, the rise of Nazism, the rise of World War II. The earliest phases were certainly 1930, 31, 32, 33, 36. 1930, by the way, and 1935, I believe, we discovered both the planet Pluto and plutonium. That's a kind of a big one to think about with the rise of World War II. The discovery of Pluto, plutonium. I always think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945, during Saturn maximum wide, super bright Saturn phase versus ring plane crossing, by the way. So ring plane crossing also 1950, the Korean War, 1966, the Vietnam War. Ring plane crossing 1980. 1980, we had a recession in the United States. Think about where we are at ring plane crossing right now, 2025. The beginnings of what some say under Donald Trump might be a very severe recession. Certainly, what's happening in these early first months, these springtime months of 2025, is a global economic crises made by Donald Trump and this president's tariffs. So the last time, one of those last ring plane crossings, 1980, we had the U.S. recession under Jimmy Carter, and Reagan following Carter, trying to recuperate from that recession. Reagan created his Reaganomics ideas of trickle-down wealth for Americans, which worked really well for corporations and probably less well for those who were middle class. 1995 was a ring plane crossing, the Oklahoma bombing. Waco occurred the next year. Atlanta and the Atlanta Olympic Games bombings. So 1995 ring plane crossing, the rings, the constraint of Saturn being removed, we actually had domestic terrorism. Think about what's happening now with our recent siege of the White House. Now, keep in mind that these phases of cycles of Saturn's rings being ring plane edge on or rings wide open, those phases happen over a 7-year period. There are each of these cycles progressive changes of Saturn's cycles that Earth-wise, in terms of astrology, we might start to look at as periods of major shift. Those rings symbolize constraint, the rings disappearing, perhaps the lack of constraint, the rings wide open, perhaps full Saturnian encumberment. The rings wide open we had in 1915. Think of 1914, World War I. 1929, the stock market crash. 1944, we were right in the middle of World War II, a year away from Germany and Japan surrendering and World War II being over, but right in the middle of the Holocaust. 1959, rings wide open. That was the really early phases of what became Vietnam conflict and Vietnam War. 1974, that was nearing the end of Vietnam, the rings wide open. And of course, that next year, the fall of Saigon. So the U.S., one could say, was beaten thoroughly after a very lengthy, nearly decade-long or more than a decade-long war. 1987, rings wide open. That was the U.S. invading the Persian Gulf and began Gulf Wars and began our pursuit of Saddam and the fall of Iraq and the beginning of the fall of a number of Middle Eastern regimes and the Arab Spring that followed. 2003, that was a rings wide open, really, really close. That was a very close apparition, a very brilliant, bright Saturn. I think Saturn was in opposition 2003. And that was a time period that, again, we're back in Iraq. And those Iraq wars that followed. And I think that was when we really took Saddam Hussein out. That was also the time of the U.S. proving that Iraq had yellow cake, that had the fixins for nuclear armaments. 2016, the last time that the rings were super wide open, that was when Donald Trump was elected first, the first Trump 1 era. So Trump 1 being elected during rings really wide open, all the constraints of the GOP, all the constraints of conservatism were in place for Trump 1 in his first presidency at the rings wide open event. And ring plane crossing 2025, Donald Trump takes center stage again when all bets are off. In the first weeks of Trump's presidency, the ring plane crossing, the rings disappearing from our line of sight, the constraints are disappeared. The constraints of Saturn, the things that hold government and the separation of let's say monarchy and the rule of law, those constraints are ripped away during this 2025 apparition so far. So all these years of rings edge on or wide open were years that the U.S. was involved in either some political or military reformation or conflict, years of extreme political and military turning points in U.S. history. Saturn seems to impose itself, one could say, clearly and literally as seen as exceptionally bright when those rings are really wide open. Constraint and order and the rule of law, or maybe even excess rule of law during those times that Saturn is really particularly significant in its ring plane crossing events or rings wide open. So astrologers know Saturn and its cycles. I always think age 7, 14, 21, wherever Saturn is when you're born, 90 degrees away, the first square, age 7, opposite to its own placement, age 14, closing square at age 21, and then a full cycle, age 30. But those 4 phases that happen every 30 years for all of us, those growing pains, as Saturn cycles coincide with human developmental phases, those cycles of Saturn also coincide with periods of sweeping change, political power change, of the sort of age of individual national identities. So astrologers coincide, look at rather the coincidence of Saturn cycles in human experience, age 7, 14, 21, age 30, 60, 90. We look at these major Saturnian turning points, these coincidences of Saturn's phases as it orbits the sun, as we see it visually change in our nighttime sky. And Saturn coincides with its shadow qualities often. It's really those periods of coming to maturity, coming to wisdom, and oftentimes the challenges that bring us to maturity and wisdom. So tension between the past and future is a Saturnian theme. Sudden shocks and rude awakenings, uh, especially sudden shocks in terms of, let's say, conservatism or what has been normative. We can think of 1966 ring plane crossing, the 60s, of course, Vietnam War, and the 60s culture, the 60s revolution, the British invasion musically, and the challenge that hippie culture gave to conservative America. Saturn cycles respond to or correspond rather with hyper responsibility, hypervigilance in terms of order and law and maintaining or crackdown of law and order. So that we see, for instance, during these rings wide open, Saturn rings wide open, or ring plane crossing events, like the rise of Nazism, the rise of fascism, the either the extreme application of rule of law and or the absence of the rule of law. Like everything goes, anything goes, everything is up in the air. Those are all typical Saturnian themes, particularly notable at rings wide open events every 14 years and ring plane crossing events every 14 years. Saturn cycles also coincide with the negative side of modern science and technology, misapplications, we could say, of technology. Some would argue that Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Saturn's rings wide open, was not a misapplication of plutonium, but I guess it depends on which side of things you are on. Saturn cycles can correspond to endless compromise, perseverance, but perseverance that can also become dogma or maintaining a dogmatic position. Saturn cycles, particularly these ring playing crossing events when Saturn's rings of constraint and order disappear, atheistic utopian ideas. I think of Mao and Mao's governance. I think of Pol Pot in Cambodia. These are different phases. Of course, the rise of fascism and Nazism. Generation gaps, the awareness of massive generational restructurings. We have that happening right now as we are heading into the AI generation. We're heading into AI for the first time in humanity, and we know it's a game changer. These are all Saturnine qualities. Something else I want to mention that I might have not gotten to before. During these ring plane crossing events, Saturn can only be in one of two astrological signs. Saturn will either be in the sign of Pisces, or where it is in this apparition of ring plane crossing, it's in this, pardon me, Saturn either in Virgo or where it is right now in the sign of Pisces. So we have this 14-year switch off event of Saturn disappearing rings either in the sign of Virgo or the sign of Pisces. And what might it mean? Saturn constraint, Saturn discipline, Saturn form, Saturn law. Saturn is actually not necessarily the judge, but the law that the judge executes. Those are all Saturnian themes. So Saturn in Pisces is a time of, again, greater dissolution of Saturnian themes. Saturn in Virgo, perhaps greater rigidity or greater formulation of Saturnian themes. Virgo is a sign that occurs every year after Leo. You can think of summertime, but Saturn in Virgo is that sign of back to school, back to work. So every year we have Leo and then Virgo, and Virgo always is back to school, back to work kind of an event. So Saturn in Virgo years at ring plane crossing, perhaps it's an issue of a change of how work is executed, a change of how we go to work. So those are themes we can think back to about 14 years ago now, when there was a shift of how business was operated. What was business and business attire all about? How did one go to work was a theme back then. So thanks for watching, everybody. Hopefully you'll begin to think a little bit more about these Saturn phases, the Saturn ring plane crossing event and Saturn wide open event. If you want to book an appointment with me, please do go to my webpage, www.astrologyspirit.com. You could also search for me simply on the web, astrologer Alexander, Woodstock, New York. I used to live in Woodstock. That will also bring you to my webpage. So until next time, folks, let's all dig deep into our sense of wisdom and seek for higher intention and intentional purpose. Blessings, everyone. Have a good evening. See you again.